how nice it is for an angler to live in Alaska. Just a simple next time at sea. You can catch huge cod. Even take a dip in the river. You can catch a giant king crab. Just cook it on one side. The smell of king crab got the kid next door squealing. There's a reason it's so comfortable. It's in the Aleutian Islands off Alaska, under the raging waters around it. Some mysterious creatures have appeared. They're constantly invading. It turned out to be a halibut habitat here. And what's interesting is this creature doesn't seem to have been seen anywhere else in the world. As Jeremy got off the plane, and immediately to the nearest port. It happens to be here too. The largest commercial fishing fleet in the world. 500,000 tons of seafood were exported last year. And this situation also leads to most of the people who live here are related to the ship. To understand what's going on here, Jeremy went to a local bar. I picked 2 residents at random. First, we bonded with each other. So she asked her own question. They were once able to catch 400 pounds of flounder, but now it's getting smaller. There were even other fish, and there are fish that shouldn't be here, like the cod. This is very curious, but this has been happening for 2 years now, and that got Jeremy curious. What is going on in these waters? So I set out to see for myself. Although Jeremy didn't. I fished even 1 fish here, but that didn't stop Jeremy the next day. Got on a boat that was going out to sea. As May starts the boat, Jeremy was on the boat too. Got to talking to Amy's father, George. But not all the time. George is learning that Jeremy doesn't know how to fish flounder. I began to explain it, with Jeremy setting the hook there. I was waiting for a while. The fishing rod suddenly responded. He quickly pulled the fish to the surface. But it turns out it's not a flounder. It's Pacific cod. So they returned it to the sea. Put the pole down again. But I didn't think I'd take the bait. I got a cod on it. It made him a little curious. There are no halibut under the water. But then the rod reacted again. But this thing is a little heavy. As Jeremy pulls things to the surface, it turns out this is a flounder. This was a bit of a surprise for Jeremy. Quickly picked it up, but this one only weighs a few pounds. With Jeremy putting the fish back, after another couple of hours of fishing, even though Jeremy's got 1 fish after another. But these are small, not a single halibut. That got Jeremy curious. Why those fish lying on the surface? So there's no big fish. When Jeremy returns to port, but made an unexpected discovery. There are humpback whales around here, although this whale is very large. But flounder is not on the menu. So humpback whales aren't the reason flounder disappeared. But these boats don't have special equipment. That's why Jeremy found it. A commercial vessel. As Jeremy jumped on, the ship set off at once. Followed the boat for dozens of miles. Workers have also begun to retrieve traps. As the fishing line is slowly recovered. Several cod were found. This makes the crew a little silly. But the halibut is starting to arrive. And there were several in a row. Although these traps keep getting stocked. But there are no big fish. Dozens of pounds of flounder. Not even a 50-pound fish. Which makes Jeremy a little weird, although this ship has a high loading rate. But there's no big fish. And this continued even to the end, which made Jeremy even more curious. But he's on his way home. I just ran into these 2 guys. That's Roger and Barry, the locals. They've been living here for 20 years. And I've been catching crabs here for so long. Although these 2 don't have a boat, but with full diving gear. As the 2 men continue to install equipment, Jeremy learned more about it too. Those halibut feed on king crabs. I've seen one before. There are nearly 8 feet of flounder, but I saw it in 2006. The biggest I've seen is 2 or 3 feet, with the 2 of them diving into the water. And the hunt for king crabs began. It wasn't long before I caught a crab, with the king crab cooked in the pot. Jeremy also immediately picked up a crab leg, eating and chatting over there. Gave him another piece of important information. That's the current water temperature. From the previous 30 degrees Fahrenheit. It's now 42 degrees Fahrenheit. And that made Jeremy understand something. Those king crabs, because of the rising temperature, causing the crabs here to start migrating. And that keeps the halibut away. But it destroys the local ecology. And it allowed other creatures to enter. But to understand what it is, Jeremy came to NOAA specifically, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There's a lot of fish data here. As Jeremy looked at the fish here, also found a lot of long and strange-shaped creatures, as ugly as these things are. But it also means these fish. It grows deep under the sea. After all, in that dark place, no one can see who. So you can grow whatever you want, and no one will be laughed at. But then Jeremy saw a different fish. That's the lancet fish. This fish lives in the warm subtropical ocean. And then a few days ago, this fish showed up here. You know, this ferocious fish, if it shows up here, will bring destruction to this place. But far from solving the problem, it only made Jeremy more confused. But there's another one on the island. Resident biologist. That's why Jeremy went there, as he met Melissa by the river. I got some information from him, too. Not even those warm currents. Why the invasion of Alaska? But now the warmth of 1,000 miles away. It's starting to affect all of Alaska, and the phenomenon so far, and it will continue. And the halibut here, it's really decreasing. In order to be able to understand more comprehensively, Jeremy is going further north, so he prepared to go to Umnersland. With him on a plane going over there, also discover the weather outside. It doesn't seem particularly friendly, as disturbing as this is, but it turned out well. With Jeremy successfully off the plane, he's at 6 in the afternoon too. We made it to Umnersland, although the weather in this place is very cold, but the plants here are growing exceptionally well. It looks like heaven. This looks like a nice place. If you're just hanging out here, we're more. As Jeremy continues to move forward, found a lot of abandoned houses here. It's scary though, but it's not unusual for it to happen here. With Jeremy meeting people, that excited him. I almost had to pick him up, but I kept it in check. He's still cold after all. As Jeremy eased off, quickly questioned them. Here's the halibut harvest. Although it sounds like they have 7-foot fish, and they often catch the big ones, but it only made Jeremy more curious. Are those halibut still alive in the waters around here? So the next day, he found Danny to explore the sea together. But this journey is a little long, although Jeremy's boat is thick now. But the cold kept pushing him. As the two arrived at their destination, Danny also hung the bait and start releasing lines in there constantly. And it's a reliable way to do it. After all, they have people here, have been catching halibut this way for a long time. With all the lines running out, Jeremy also started making bait. Looks like it really works, but after 2 hours straight, and yet nothing took the bait. That made Jeremy look dumb. But after pulling the line for some distance, I can't believe we got a hook. As Jeremy pulls things out of the water, turns out it's a Duffy fish. It's not what I want at all. With Jeremy releasing the fish, it also starts the previous work again, but this thing weighs 5 pounds. It made Jeremy very tired, but then the line suddenly responded. So he quickly started to the recycling line. As things are pulled aboard, you can tell it's a flounder, and it weighs 30 pounds. Although this weight is 10 times that previously obtained in the port, but the fish is still not big enough. Still, it's a good response. As Jeremy continues with the previous operation, it didn't take long to restock. But after pulling the stuff out, only to find out it was a cod. It's big and pretty, but the fish wasn't the target. As the two men came to the last spot, it was 10:30 p.m., but the line of sight is very good. With the cod repeatedly hooked, the two also gave up for the time being, prepared to rest before returning to the island. As the next morning came, the weather is now 36 degrees Celsius with strong winds. This greatly increased the difficulty of the voyage. However, the two men arrived safely in the established sea. As Jeremy gets familiar with the process, I don't even need Danny's help right now. You can set everything up, but this cold weather, Jeremy can barely feel his fingers, but in his constant busyness, and he added gloves to his hands. He also regained feeling in his fingers, but the sea at this time, but it started to get vicious. And this represents a 2-person boat. It could tip over at any moment, so they had to return to land. But the next day came. This bad weather, it hasn't changed at all, because a lot of people go to sea in this weather, and he died of it. So Danny doesn't want to take any chances at this point. But Jeremy didn't want to stop there. But someone once said, halibut can also be caught on the shore. So Jeremy came to the shore. The preparations began, as he cast the hook into the sea. It also made him feel like he used to swing. But there's only one problem. This hook needs to be on the shore. It sits for almost 12 hours. That's what makes Jeremy so. Don't know what to do anymore. Had to wander around the island. As time slowly passes, Jeremy had come to the shore by this time, ready to lay out another route, and the one in front had an accident. I don't know when. The rope broke. As hard as this news is to hear, but it also means there could be halibut. So Jeremy hurriedly, he threw out a hook again, had to rearrange a route. As a new day comes again, Jeremy pulls the rope back slowly. It's just a sad result. Can come after the next day. The weather here remains unchanged. As another day comes, it's still the same here, and so long to wait. It made Jeremy very impatient. But even if he wanted to leave now, the weather here doesn't allow it. After all, this plane is a lesson in history. But he got good news from the people here. That's who came here. 5 weeks tops. And now it's been a week. With the arrival of day 8, the weather is still the same. So Jeremy decided, no more sitting around. Then he made a phone call, get a helicopter out of Dutch Harbor. And it's expected to be in an hour. You can get here. So Jeremy and his team got some quick stuff packed up, falling with the helicopter from the sky. And I put things together right away and began to leave the island, with Jeremy on the plane for 2 hours, and to a new place, William Bay. The weather here is totally different. Not only is there no fog, you can even see the sun in the sky. And now is basically the last chance. If there's no halibut here, the results were clear, of course. The fish have gone further north. As Jeremy resets the fishing rod, it's using what he knows best. And the man with the fishing rod, it's also become extremely lively. Looks like this fishing rod is capable to make him feel safe. But then the rod suddenly bent. So Jeremy quickly began to reel in and slowly fish there. Looks like it's not a small thing down here, only to find out when it came out. This is another big cod, although it's not what he wants. But to hook a fish this big still made him very happy. As he put the pole back together, and the waiting began again. Although this time it took more than an hour for something to bite. But the way Jeremy was struggling, I was afraid he might fall in. But good thing he wasn't there to pull. The fishing has begun, but that didn't make it easy for him. Instead, it started repeating itself. But the old man was still in the mood for a joke. With his continued efforts, and pulled a flounder to the surface. And that gives him a sense of the size of this one. Quickly cooperated with the captain. Got the fish into the boat. And this halibut gets on board. And that led Jeremy to his conclusion. There's still halibut to be caught here. But apparently, there are fewer of them. There are a lot of reasons for this, though. But if left unchecked, the results will get worse and worse. Well, that's all for this program. Give it a thumbs up, and let's look forward to the next episode. Look at these bears in front of you. Even though they seem harmless. But there was this old six. Came up behind an old man, ready to give him a love hug. The old man took his time, pulled out a strange object. I can't believe I just shot that brown bear. Frightened, he ran away. In the rivers of Alaska, the largest salmon breeding ground in the world, there are 5 species of Pacific salmon. Lived here for thousands of years. One fish in particular is unique. They are faster than the other fish. That's the king salmon. But in the last few days, this fish is missing. And here are the other 4. Salmon, pink salmon, coho, and sockeye salmon are still migrating and spawning, and then return to the sea, and then come back here a few years later. But now it's just the king salmon. There was no further return. This made Jeremy very curious. So he first went to the Kenai River to investigate. After all, there were people here once, caught a 100-pound salmon, in this amazing event, from this very river. Naturally, this attracts a lot of people. Come here for fishing, with Jeremy looking for an angler. Also know the people. Even if you fish here all the time, it's been a long time since we've seen king salmon. It's just more confirmation of Jeremy's idea. You can catch all kinds of salmon here, but I just can't get any more king salmon. But it also aggravated him. Curious about the disappearance of the king salmon, whether it is because of the environment or human beings. To make sure it wasn't environmental, Jeremy also started his favorite swing. After all, sockeye salmon are very sensitive to their environment. Just catch the fish. You know the state of the river. But you can't just flip it. It's still going to take something different. That's the lead at the end. As soon as a fish bites the slightest bit of line, you can slide the hook into the fish's mouth. As Jeremy throws the pole, I can't believe I hit one shot like that. As he pulls back the line, quickly picked up the net, scoop up the fish. When Jeremy looks at this sockeye salmon, found the fish very active, and the eyes look very bright. I don't know how it's any different than buying it at the supermarket, though. But Jeremy is an old hand at this. He thinks there is no problem with the water here. Shouldn't that be too much of a difference? But it made him curious. It's not the environment. So what caused the disappearance of king salmon? But Jeremy had another predator in mind. They don't just weigh 1,000 pounds, and an appetite that can never be satiated. That's the aggressive brown bear. And they're just like the T-1000, but it does target salmon in the river. So Jeremy's ready to take a look, ready to see if the bears are being overhunted. And he brought in a bear behavior expert, Matthias Brett. I also got an important prop from him. It's a weapon like a vision, and this thing is really awesome. Pull the top lead. There would be a lot of smoke and flames. It's going to last about 7 minutes. This is enough to scare the bear and survive until someone picks up the body. Of course, it depends on whether the bear is interested in you. As the 2 men came to a place, spotted 5 brown bears ahead, where the river meets the sea. When the tide goes out here, there will be plenty of salmon left. And that's why these bears are here, right? That's when Jeremy hit on something. One of the bears suddenly started running. It was as if their salmon buffet had begun. And while Jeremy was having fun, behind him came a waiter. That scared Jeremy right away. Hold on to the props in your hand. Be ready to pull the lead out at any time. But the good thing is this bear is obvious. Not interested in either of them. After all, if this is about 2 people, and it's not worth it to end the buffet. And this has greatly increased their courage. Straight to the beach. The brown bear gets a closer look. But after the 2 of them watched for half a day, they were surprised to find these brown bears. I didn't catch a single king salmon. So Jeremy went to the Yukon River. Came here to see if it was man-made. After all, the indigenous people here, salmon have been hunted for thousands of years. They must know a lot about king salmon. With Jeremy came a small town, and there was no one there. This made him feel very strange. If you don't even have kids, that means there's probably no one here anymore. But it looks very clean outside. But when Jeremy got to the river, but accidentally hitched a ride on a fishing boat. And that explains his earlier question. That's the people here are taking advantage of salmon runs. Stock up on food this winter. With Jeremy comes a Ruby village. That's where I'm going to ask. And the people of this village let him talk to Billy McCarthy. With Jeremy finding this one, native. As the two men said hello, Jeremy learned something too. Although there used to be plenty of king salmon here, it never even seemed like a lack. But now I never see it again. To this end, the locals also changed the staple food to another kind of salmon. But now Jeremy is even more confused. It's not a man-made overgrab. It's not brown bear hunting. So what's the reason? But while Jeremy was wondering, only to see a man who had just returned from hunting quickly came forward to make inquiries. I saw what he got. Not a lot, though, but it's also perfectly self-sufficient. As the two continued to talk, and Jeremy knows that too. Jack was arrested here for 24 years. They also found that there are fewer king salmon now, and the population is getting smaller. This surprised Jeremy, and Jack found pike in the river. It's like they're preying on salmon. Jeremy was convinced when he heard that. After all, these fish can grow up to 50 pounds. His mouth was even full of teeth, and very greedy. Can have a huge impact on fish stocks. So Jeremy went to a new place. Get ready to fish out the barracuda here. See if it's the fish. With Jeremy getting the fishing rod ready, and stepped right into the water, and throw a fishing rod out of his hand. I just didn't expect him to do it again. Although the fish put up quite a fight, but he still put it in the net. As Jeremy picks up the fish, turns out this one's a little small. There's no threat to the king salmon at all. So, he had to go deeper. As Jeremy stopped walking, the line fell into the water again. I didn't expect a fish to bite the hook right away. As Jeremy pulls the line back in, there's something different about this fish. After catching the fish in the net, straight to the shore. Turns out it's a hump salmon. Although the meat of this fish is good, but his jaw was unsightly. It's a hook-like one. With this fish also released, Jeremy was ready to go on with his work. But then there was an unexpected discovery. There was one right in front of me, a perfectly formed barracuda. But it was a flash that made Jeremy more interested. After a few throws in a row, the fishing rod is finally responding. As Jeremy slowly pulls it back, it was also discovered that this fish was a barracuda. It's just not big enough. Although the fish's mouth can open very wide, but it's not a threat to the king salmon. But you can do that to the little hatchlings to carry out a brutal hunt. After all, those young salmon are going to be here for 2 years before they start running out to sea. But this is for all the little fish. So this is not the main reason for the disappearance of king salmon. In order to understand more comprehensively, Jeremy pulled out a map. Even though these fish travel very far, they even went to other countries. Although there are costs along the way, but the other fish were fine. Plus, no upstream problems were found. Jeremy decided to go downstream. Look where the river meets the sea. With Jeremy comes a port. There's something weird about this place. It's not just deserted. You can even see a lot of abandoned machines. And there's not a soul in sight. Although maybe that's because it's 10 o'clock at night. But as Jeremy moves on, find a lot of people at the docks. Look at all the fish here. You can also find here is a place where people catch salmon, which makes Jeremy suspicious. If these people are stopping the king salmon. But when Jeremy opened a box, and they didn't find anything in there, so he found a local. I was asked about this place. They don't collect king salmon, because too few do not provide value. But then a fishing boat came along. So Jeremy came to the shore at once. Look at what they got. Although there are a lot of fish here, but none of them were king salmon. This also made him believe the workers' words. They don't overfish. And that made Jeremy even more confused. But just then, 2 more men arrived. There's even a Jeremy fan among them. I just wanted an autograph first. Sure enough, it wasn't a fan there. The first thing you do is ask for an autograph. But Jeremy says he's in no hurry and he's not leaving right away. Then he asked the 2 men about it. I heard it from them. There's a salmon data station near here. There might be something there he wants. With Jeremy giving the autograph out, I got a local snack too. There's just something weird about this one, but it's still acceptable. It's just raw fish eggs after all. As Jeremy left the harbor, also boarded a ship that was about to leave port. Get ready to check out that data station. With Jeremy freezing on the boat, and came to the destination of this trip. But he was stopped at the door. There was this sort of dam on the river. There's even a crate in the back. It looks like there's a lot of fish in there. Just then a man came down from the shore, helped the ship out of the situation. Let Jeremy make it to shore. Met the team here, and these people are not easy. Used to work for FWS, with the station master bringing Jeremy into the house. I also showed him why there was something in the river. The station master also said at this time, they haven't seen king salmon in a long time. Although this is surprising. But that's what happened. As the 2 men came to the basket, Jeremy picked up the net again, ready to start what he knows best. But there's nothing in his net. This makes Jeremy a little anxious. That's when it all started again. As he measured the fish, and the collection of samples, and found something amazing. These salmon are not suffering any signs of disease or environmental damage. But it's the king salmon population. It is 10% lower than in previous years. Then there was a member of the station. I gave him another path, deep in the ocean. After all, when the salmon got in, you live in it for 6 or 7 years. I'm going to start coming back here. It is quite possible that they had an accident at this time. But Jeremy is no ocean expert. He contacted his friends specifically for this purpose. That is Dr. Alberg. He's been doing some research on salmon. And I told Jeremy, a very interesting phenomenon. The instruments they tagged on the salmon. There is a large part of the display. The environment these fish live in. It suddenly jumps from 45 to 70. And that's a sign that the fish were eaten. And with all the instruments, that, too, led Dr. Olberg's team to determine. The salmon were eaten by sharks in the sea. But the data don't tell the whole story. The sharks have wiped out the king salmon in the sea. But they must have taken a lot. It's on the silicon shark diet, after all. So Jeremy set off right away, as he reached a body of water. Also ready here. Go fishing for a silicon shark. After all, they could very well be the reason. Before you get there, Jeremy was on the boat too, and began to get ready to fish for sharks. In order to be able to make sure that things are hooked, he's done a lot of preparation. And just then the captain took a rope, prepared to strap it to the boat. After all, those sharks are pretty strong. Just one careless. Jeremy will fall into the water. Follow him as he hangs the bait. It is also the beginning of the fishing line into the water. But we don't know where those sharks are. Jeremy has to take his time. So the length of the fishing line was limited to 20 feet. But he waited on the boat for half a day. There was nothing wrong on the river. So Jeremy changed tack. To get the bait on that hook, it looks more attractive. Jeremy was just going up and down. But it went on for almost an hour. Still no gain. The bait was immediately retrieved and rearranged at 100 feet down. Also repeated to make the rod go up and down. But he still didn't get anything. That got Jeremy in the mood, like the rain on this river. I even wondered if the shark wasn't here. But when his patience began to wear thin, there was a sudden movement in his fishing rod. So Jeremy hurried to retrieve the fishing line. But it's not a silicon shark. It was a very ugly fish. This made his mood even worse. With his second rain falling, Jeremy also returned home. But in the course of the day, there was no gain. Still makes him very curious. Those silicon sharks are back there. After all, the salmon are disappearing right now. These sharks are the main reason. Now that theory is a little discredited. But in order to ensure their own rigor, the next day Jeremy went to the river again. But this time his target has changed. Not those silicon sharks anymore. They're migrating salmon in the river. After all, he now thinks the migration season is over. But after he caught a fish, all this has been broken again. But this salmon was attacked by a sea lion. With Jeremy loading up, also found in this river, there are still salmon running. Although I don't know why the shark isn't here. But still learned, the silicon shark is responsible for the disappearance of the salmon. But the next day, Jeremy saw a very interesting image. That's the local killer whale. It was a very strange increase, which leads Jeremy to a possibility. That's these killer whales that don't eat salmon. After trying it once, we'll be interested in these. Jeremy immediately set out to explore. Followed him to the surface. Ben's a bit of a laid-back guy. Suddenly, there was a killer whale. At their own distance, began to continuously jump out of the water. And seeing these killer whales, it was also very surprising to him. After all, there are still very few killer whales. To be able to see so many at once. Obviously, they were influenced by a number of factors, causing these killer whales to swarm here. But Jeremy didn't bring it. Something to hook a killer whale onto a boat. So he wanted to see if he could be here. Caught some possible salmon. But it didn't work out so well. Jeremy didn't have anything to gain. But he didn't let that stop him. After a new day, a boat was found again. But he was lucky. The captain had the pleasure of meeting a killer whale hunting the salmon. And when Jeremy found out from him, quickly asked the captain what was hunting. And this guy is honest. Let's just say they feed mainly on king salmon. Even though Jeremy didn't catch anything today. But they also learned what killer whales do. And it also makes him feel it's the end of the king salmon. To be sure, there are fish. A successful return to the spawning grounds. Jeremy's working with a local FWS to a spawning ground for salmon. Look for any king salmon that might be there. As they pull in one net after another. Found a lot of salmon on it, but not a single king salmon. When the 3 came to the last net, a successful sighting of an emperor salmon. Quickly put it in the box. Couldn't even bring it on board. I'm afraid the fish will be lost. After all, there are fewer and fewer fish. Now every fish has to bear the burden of reproduction and the decline of this species. It's obviously not easy. From the very beginning with barracuda and people. In the present day, silicon sharks and killer whales. That brought the species close to extinction. But we still have the king salmon. They may recover again someday in the future. Well, that's all for this program. Give it a thumbs up, and let's look forward to the next episode.